Hi everybody, it's Georgia Reed from Cybercrime magazine, and we are at NYIT again in Manhattan today. It's Halloween, October 31st, 2018, and it's our second Ask the CISO interview sponsored by Fortinet. And I'm here today with the Chief Security Officer, Jim Routh from Aetna. Welcome and thanks for coming down today.
Thanks, Georgia. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for coming down. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about what it's like managing all of the security and operations for a company that's as large as Aetna and as important as Aetna in this day and age with cybersecurity the way it is and the amount of consumers and customers that you have. So just give us a little background about yourself. How did you get into cybersecurity and how long have you been doing this?
Sure. So I've been doing cybersecurity for 20 years. I've been doing IT for about 35 years, and I owe my security career to my wife.
Okay.
And the reason is I was a consultant for many years, and then we had kids, and the travel didn't work very well, so I convinced my wife to move the whole family out to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I had a great job with American Express in IT. And I really enjoyed it. I had like a 15-minute commute. I'd go from a heated garage to a heated garage in the winter.
Well, that's good in Minneapolis.
Exactly.
Right.
And but my wife, not so much. She had to, schlep the kids to school and to activities and shopping and all that stuff. And the temperatures got kind of cold in the winter. So after the third winter, one night at dinner, my wife said to me, look, the kids and I are moving back east. Would you like to come? So that was kind of the trigger event that said, oh, I guess I have to find a new job. So I said, yeah, I think I would like to come. So I called my boss at American Express, and I said, you got to get me out of here. Come on, whatever it takes, you got to get me out of here. And he said, all right, well, we have an opportunity for you. It's on the business side. It's not in IT. And I said, I will sweep the floors. I don't care what it is. And he's like, okay. So I moved back to New York, and I ended up running consumer data analytics for the U.S. domestic card business. And I did that for about 2.5 years. Great experience. Learned a ton. We called them econometricians back then, but today they're data scientists. And it was all behavioral based. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but that actually was a foundational component for cybersecurity today. So that was kind of my first introduction. Now, it turns out, because I reported the chief risk officer, they merged the marketing analytics with the risk analytics teams. I reported the chief risk officer. I knew the business and I had an IT background. So I was the first CISO at American Express. And that's where I got my introduction into security. It never would have happened without my wife, so I owe it to her.
That's a really interesting story, and I want to talk to you about the data science aspect and how does that help you understand ransomware and hacking and breaches when it comes to the data science?
Yeah, so today we have about 300 machine learning models running frontline security controls across 8 platforms in the enterprise, and we'll have about 500 next year. So that gives you an indication of scale. So using models to actually influence frontline security controls is becoming more prevalent, and you can buy vendor products that have machine learning models in there, like endpoint protection that look for anomalies and vulnerabilities using machine learning technology, in which all you're doing as an enterprise is basically deploying the agent across your endpoints, and it's doing its job on its own. Or you can create bespoke models using data scientists that are unique and specific. We have a lot of our online fraud cases are somewhat unique in healthcare or health insurance, so we develop bespoke models for them. So that gives you a sense of the scale of what's possible today, and this is going to continue. And the reason it's going to continue is that it turns out if you can identify behavioral patterns and compare them with past behavioral patterns, you can create a risk score, or specifically a deviation score, between the normal pattern and what's actually happening. And that's really useful information to determine that the end user is the end user.
And not a malicious.
and not someone else.
Right.
So it turns out that behavior doesn't lie. Now, as humans, we know this because when we speak to people and we think they're not telling the truth, we are in tune to look at their body language and see if there are clues from their body, because your body language doesn't lie. Well, that's behavior, it doesn't lie. And so online behavior across multiple attributes, it's very easy to determine whether it's the actual person at the other end or someone else pretending to be that person's identity.
Or a bot, or some sort of.
Or automation, a bot.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, and AI is such a hot topic right now in cyber. I mean, I have a marketing background, so we would use data analytics all the time for the consumer. So it's really interesting how it's coming across on the cybersecurity platform
It's
as well.
really, it's part of the new digital consumer experience.
Right. And that's basically everything is online now with healthcare. So before we jump into what you're doing at Aetna, let's go back a little bit. I know that you headed up security for American Express, JP Morgan, Chase. What are the similarities and differences between banking and financials versus healthcare and health insurance when it comes to leading that as a CISO?
Yeah, it's interesting because the first observation I made, and really the first assumption I made, was that the diversity of threat actors in financial services are significantly higher than in healthcare. And this is about 5 years ago when I entered healthcare. And it turns out I was wrong. The diversity of threat actors in healthcare are just as diverse as financial services. So we've got.
So that was what you originally thought.
I thought that the diversity would be different. There'd be fewer types of threat actors. And the difference is the volume. The volume in financial services is exponentially greater, but the diversity of threat actor is ubiquitous really across industries today. Nation states have massive cyber espionage and cyber criminal enterprises that impact all industries today and all consumers in some shape, form, or fashion. 5 years ago, nation states weren't as brazen in their attacks on private infrastructure and consumers. Today, that's fundamentally changed. And the anonymity of the internet has shielded nation state sponsored cyber criminal activity. And so all of us have to deal with nation states, criminal syndicates, hacktivists. The diversity of threat actors is just as significant across industries today. And so that was a learning. The other learning is that in financial services, the crown jewels of data represent about 10% of all the data in the enterprise. For an enterprise in financial services, you can wrap your arms around the fact that you have to protect the crown jewels being 10% of the data because you can put your best controls on them. In healthcare, about 80% of the data in the enterprise is the crown jewels in terms of consumer patient health information.
Sure.
And so it's hard to scale the best controls across an enterprise. You end up going with the lowest common denominator, and that's not necessarily a good thing from a control standpoint. So that's an indication of how the attack surface in healthcare exponentially greater than financial services. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor asks you to fill out any medical history form,
and I'm putting my health insurance number on there,
and they're asking for your social security number on it. So that's on a piece of paper. That piece of paper gets copied and put into a file. Somebody types that into a Windows XP computer, which isn't necessarily the safest thing in the world, and then enters it into a system. And you and your information are identified by your social security number as it tracks through the healthcare ecosystem. So if there's diagnostic services that you need, if there's MRIs that you need, if there are blood tests that you need, all of the intermediaries are small organizations, relatively speaking, that pass information, your medical information, attributed to a social security number, which is essentially the most marketable asset to a criminal.
Yeah.
So protecting that across the entire healthcare ecosystem is a large attack surface and therefore a significant challenge.
So day to day at Aetna, what are some of the biggest challenge you face? How do you deal with that?
So mostly my job, and this is true of any cybersecurity professional, is to determine how to allocate scarce resource to the highest risk. And that's...
Do you triage it?
Yeah, it is triaging, because you never have enough resources to do everything. So you have to pick and choose where you want to make investments in terms of the allocation of resource.
Yeah, crisis control and management.
Exactly.
Do you get a lot of incidents? I mean, not that you have to speak to them necessarily, but what about ransomware attacks? I mean, ransomware is just so much on the rise right now.
It is. We haven't had any ransomware attacks within the enterprise. Most of the ransomware is spread through opportunistic kinds of attacks, and they're for a mature.
They're going to go for the lowest hanging fruit, kind of.
Yeah.
It's not that protected, so I'll just attack there.
There are smaller entities that have less resource and therefore more vulnerabilities that get exploited in data destructive kinds of ransomware. Larger organizations with some level of sophistication, it's less likely. Now, we're still attacked through phishing attacks about 4 times a day. A phishing attack will have success in somebody putting in credentials. And so we have to then block the credential entry into the website, and in some cases we have to take down websites that are phishing websites. So we have to remediate that, and that's just one example. And the reason for that, and all of those, by the way, are emails that are coming from a compromised email account that's recognized by the individual.
Right.
And they...
Oh, it's Jim emailing me again.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And so the insider threat is probably the biggest issue when it comes to that.
With phishing, it's when somebody's credentials are harvested, their email account gets taken over, and then that's used to spread phishing emails. That's the hardest to detect and prevent.
Right.
We are working on some machine learning capability today that will recognize that the email's not coming from the email account owner,
different
that it's
behavior,
someone else,
red
because
flag.
it's different behaviors.
Exactly.
Again, it's machine learning models identifying patterns of behavior.
Well, because humans make mistakes. I'm not going to call my boss every time he sends me an email to check that it was really him.
That's true.
So speaking of employees, how many employees are there at Aetna?
60,000.
Okay. And they're all under your purview, in a way?
Well, their information is, yeah.
Their information.
Yeah.
And do you think that consumers are getting smarter when it comes to cybersecurity in their healthcare?
Consumers are becoming much more aware of cybersecurity in the digital ecosystem. They understand that there's risk. What they don't necessarily know across the board are what techniques to use through different channels that they're choosing to use. And it's getting a little bit more complicated. So if I'm a consumer in the digital world, it turns out that I'm led to believe that the products and services that I use are designed for me as a consumer. And so I think like I'm consuming Gmail.
Right, or this is safe, it's secure.
Well, I'm assuming that it's designed for me as the customer. And in fact, that's not the case. The technologies are designed for the customer, but the customer isn't the consumer. And so you scratch your head and say, well, wait a minute. If the customer is not the consumer, how does that work? Well, ask yourself this question. How much do you pay to use Gmail?
Sure, the advertisers are the consumers.
The advertisers are the customers.
Gotcha.
So the question is, if the advertisers are the customers, who are we as the consumer? And the answer is, we're the product.
Right. How many clicks can you get on this ad?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we think of ourselves in the digital consumer experience as a product, or more specifically that our information is the product, then we're product managers. So we have to make choices on how much of our information we're going to give as a product. And if we think in those terms, we have a chance of being safe in terms of cybersecurity.
Mhm.
But if we think of ourselves as a consumer that's using a service designed for us, and we're willing to give up our information, including our behavioral information, then we have less control and we have higher risk.
Yeah,
so
then the
there's
attack
a trade-off.
surface is just exponentially bigger
Right.
for the malicious intent.
Exactly.
So you wrote an article recently that I saw published, I think it was on LinkedIn. Cybersecurity has evolved into something every person has to confront in daily life. So we're talking about that. You said these three things. One, software is more important than hardware. What did you mean by that?
Meaning that we used to apply security controls to hardware infrastructure and have a level of perimeter level security across the enterprise as a result. If you look today at the modern enterprise, the majority of security controls are in the software layer. And in fact, the security controls have to follow the data wherever they go. And so software capability is far more important than hardware capability when it relates to security controls.
So the four letters that you talk about in this article, MATH, M-A-T-H, what is that?
So if you buy into the construct that behavioral models can determine patterns of behavior that match certain patterns and anomalies to that, there turns out that there are lots of use cases where you can use that capability across the enterprise in frontline security controls. Now I'm going to give you one example, but there are many examples in production today. But one example is with authentication. Now, we as security professionals and as IT professionals were taught that authentication is an event. So online authentication always has a beginning and an end. So if you provide your user ID and your password, essentially your credentials, you're in. In other words, the event's ended. You're accepted and you're in the system.
Okay.
So that's two things. Number one, it's an event with a beginning and the end. Number two, the controls are binary. You can't be halfway in. You're either in or you're not. You either have the password or you don't. So it's an event with binary controls.
Right.
So today, the industry pundits talk about multi-factor authentication.
Sure, the two-factor, you get the text message, that stuff.
Exactly. And multi-factor authentication is actually not the destination because it's too limited and there's no way of putting controls in place, authentication controls, without adding friction to the consumer. And we've already determined, and you know, it's pretty clear that the consumer doesn't do well with friction, specifically passwords.
Oh, this is frustrating. I'm not ever using them again.
Bingo.
Right.
Or this site I don't really care about, so I'm going to use a very simple password, and I'll use it
My
at all the
dog's
sites
name.
I don't care about. But it turns out that when those passwords are harvested, they can be used in credential stuffing across all domains.
Very dangerous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so people, it turns out 45% of people responding to a survey said that they wouldn't change their password even when the site was compromised and they knew criminals had their password. Right? Now that just points
lazy.
out people are people.
Yeah,
right?
human beings.
So there's actually a way of using people's characteristics and advantageously designing an authentication experience that's better security with less friction, but it requires us to unlearn something. We have to unlearn the fact that authentication is supposed to be an event. And if we think about authentication as a continuous process, we can take behavioral attributes, turn them into an algorithm representing a specific behavioral pattern, measure real-time behavior against that pattern, create a deviation score, do that across 30 to 60 different attributes, come up with one risk score, feed it to the application in real time, and the app decides how much access to give you to the web app or to the mobile app in real time, based on what your risk score is. And your risk score is an indicator of what your behavioral attributes are.
So the password, you think, will be the way of the dinosaur eventually?
The password is fundamentally obsolete today.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Now, it happens to be in 99% of all of our authentication across the internet today. So we have to fundamentally change that and move to a continual behavioral-based authentication model. That's the destination. Multi-factor authentication is just a stopping point along the way.
Yeah, it's like a second password, really.
Right.
So behavioral stuff is really interesting. What if you don't think it'll be like bio fingerprint reading and iris scans and things like that?
So biometrics are not continuous behavioral-based authentication. They're a tool that can be used in continuous behavioral-based authentication. So
Gotcha.
if you wanted to use a particular swipe style on your phone, and you swiped a certain way, with certain pressure in your finger, that could be one attribute that's fed into the continuous behavioral attribute risk engine.
Before we wrap up, I did want to talk to you. We were talking before we started recording about that 11% statistic of women in cybersecurity, and we've been challenging that quite a bit at Cybersecurity Ventures. We've been doing more research and saying that we just don't think that's true. I'd love for you to tell our audience a little bit about your hiring practices at Aetna, especially the cybersecurity team. Where do you recruit your talent in this age of a lack of resources and talent, and how about the women on your team and the minorities?
Sure. Well, there's a scarcity of talent in cybersecurity, and that obviously is a marketplace condition that every enterprise has to deal with. But it turns out you can turn the tables on that by teaching people what they want to learn and not asking people to live where they don't want to live. So if you allow people to live where they want to live and work where they want to live, you actually get access to a part of the market that's that other enterprises don't get, because
You're
they
talking
force
about
them.
like a remote
Yes.
and virtual kind of thing?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
That's interesting.
The second thing is teaching them what they want to learn makes them more marketable. And that's actually in the best interest of the organization and the individual. Now, it's unconventional, but it's the right thing to do for the individual, and it's the right thing to do for the enterprise, because at Aetna, we design new controls. And so you get to learn about new technology and new enabling capability that creates friction for threat actors. That knowledge is really marketable. And so we allow every individual to choose what skills or competencies they wish to learn, and we have a professional development plan for every single individual where we map opportunities for them to learn that into the work that they do day in, day out.
That's great.
They have 10% of their time is free time that they can do whatever they want with, and that's just one way for them to reinvest in their talent development.
So you do a lot of professional development. Do you have online coursework that they do?
Yeah, we actually teach everybody data science fundamentals, and we have a whole data science curriculum for those that want to be data scientists in cybersecurity. So we're organically growing skills, and so we only have one requirement. The individual has to have an appetite, an intellectual curiosity, and an appetite that's driven by seeking more information and knowledge. And if they have that, we can teach them everything else.
Yeah, then they have all the resources right there.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
We have 40% of our team are women, 23% are people of color, and 17% are veterans. So we have a very diverse environment and world-class talent. And we've never, ever paid for a recruiting fee for anybody that has joined. So we don't have any trouble finding top talent. We use our network, and essentially we attract people that want to learn.
I wish we had more time. This has been a very interesting talk. We're going to definitely ask you some more questions off the video so that we can write up a great editorial about you and what you're doing. But I just want to say thanks again for coming down. We talked machine learning models, data science, women in cyber. This is really interesting. Thanks so much.
Georgia, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.